Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of environmental chemistry in pesticide risk assessment. So many of you, I hope, are in some way related to looking at contaminants, say, in water. I know that water is the major focus of the center, and that's also my background. Let me see how I'll do this. But before we start on all of that, I'm putting a question out to everyone that I'll come back to later, but this gives you a little bit of a chance to think about it. Something that you do maybe every day that involves a risk. And so you can kind of think about that, and I'll come back to that question a little bit later in the talk. So just wanted to start with the most important uh, thing, and that's my family. And just to share with you a little bit about myself, I've been married almost 35 years to my husband, Jim. We have two granddaughters, Evie and Corinne, who live near us in North Carolina. Two sons, Mitchell and Alex, and my little brother, Owen, who's actually taller than me, but our dog, Bo, and my mom, Susie, who lives in South Carolina. Little bit about Bayer, just a very little bit, just to make sure everybody knows a tad about this company. So there's three divisions of Bayer. You may not realize there's the pharmaceutical part that more people are used to seeing with Bayer aspirin, but they also make the pharma part of Bayer makes cardiology and oncology drugs, also birth control products. So we have three divisions: the pharma division, the consumer health. So we make products like Claritin, which many of you may be aware of, and then we have the crop science business. And so Bayer is the largest agriculture company in the marketplace today globally, and we have around 100,000 employees within all three divisions in 83 countries, and we spend on an annual basis something like $5 billion in research and development. So we spend a lot of money on research, and our currency really is innovation. So as a company, that's what we sell, is innovation. Um, and so our main goal as a company and our vision is health for all, hunger for none. And it's a really nice way and succinct way to say that we're tackling the global challenges of health and nutrition. Is everybody hearing me okay? Sounds all right? Okay, good. Another thing that I wanted to mention was sort of the philosophy that Bayer has. It's called our life values. So all employees within Bayer over the last 10 years, this has been a guiding principle for us in setting up goals for our professional development, for example. Also, we recognize each other's strengths on these life values. That's leadership, integrity, flexibility, and efficacy. And so this guides our practices at the company. It's a really easy way to remember, and that it's a life value, and that we are a life science company. So I thought maybe it'll be helpful to go a little bit into my background, tell you kind of where I came from, um, and cover a little bit of that for students, because usually those are the questions I get. How did you end up in this job? And so just to talk a little bit about that, and my water creds, I guess, water research creds. I started out at University of South Carolina in the chemistry department, and I love analytical chemistry, but also environmental chemistry. And so I started out doing a project where we were looking at persistent organic pollutants in large lakes. So I got to do a study on the Great Lakes, and also in Lake Baikal in Russia. And so I had a great professor, Dr. Terry Beidelman, who was my graduate advisor, but I got to go out on ships, dragging all kinds of air samplers and water samplers onto these ships and working in very tiny, tiny laboratories while the floor is moving, trying to process water samples. It was a great experience. And I felt like maybe I was making some small contribution to saving our planet. And that really woke up a lot of curiosity in me and a love for research. And, um, and so once I finished my PhD in chemistry, I moved on and, as mentioned, so this picture just basically is to say that um, I was just a budding scientist at that time and was really flourishing, working with my professors at College of Charleston when I got my undergraduate degree, and then later at University of South Carolina um, with my graduate degree, but also participating in things like American Chemical Society and CTAC. And that's how I started to build sort of a scientific network of collaborators. So from my PhD work, I went to Maryland to the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center and started out as a postdoc, but then moved later into a scientist role. And so, protecting and improving the quality of air and water in the Chesapeake Bay was a major focus of my research. And you can see here, this is one of the students that I work with, Jen Fetcho, who also was a College of Charleston grad. Came to work in my lab. And then this is my friend and colleague, Kathleen Hateman, who Dan knows very well. And we did a lot of work on the various tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. How many of you are familiar with the Chesapeake? Few people, yeah? Okay. So then you'll know that the issue with the Chesapeake is its watershed. It has a huge watershed relative to the actual surface water, and it's also a very shallow water body. And so what's happening on the land really influences what happens in the bay. And so you have all kinds of species like blue crabs and rockfish, these iconic species that are really struggling within the Chesapeake Bay. And so there's a huge effort among 6 states and the District of Columbia to try to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And really, when I came to the USDA, that's when I started to understand the power of partnerships and building collaborations. And really, the progress that's happened, there's still a lot of work to go on the Chesapeake Bay. It's certainly not a finished project, but thousands of scientists have worked on Chesapeake Bay restoration. And, along with policymakers and NGOs, government laboratories, and academics all working together. And so when I was reflecting, when I was putting this talk together, it almost become like a little bit bigger a tree of collaborators and a network of partners that I work with at the USDA, from the USGS to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation of EPA, NOAA, University of Maryland, University of Delaware. I could go on and on. There was a lot of different partners that I work with at the USDA. And I would say that if you don't have strong partnerships and those that are true partnerships, not just in name, then you can really make a lot of progress and you can see the payoff for that. If you don't have a true partnership, then the benefits are really limited in short term. So I still collaborate, even though I've been gone almost 10 years, I still collaborate with the colleagues at the USDA. And so, yeah, back in around the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, I started working at Bayer Crop Science. And here's some pictures of my colleagues. And so up here, and this was my first team that I worked with. And Martha, you can see somebody that you know in that picture. This is Ellen Arthur. She is my boss, my first boss at Bayer, and she actually recruited me. And I met her through the American Chemical Society meetings. Um, and then this is the team that I work with now, the Regulatory Scientific Affairs team. And we're a global team, but the majority of folks are either in St. Louis, Missouri, or Mannheim, Germany. And so we're a group of more senior level scientists and have expertise in all different areas of science around agriculture, toxicologists, we have physicians, we have epidemiologists and pollinator experts, and really anything that you can think of relative to crop protection and biotechnology, especially around the regulation of those things. So I often get asked, why did you make the move to Bayer? Why are you still there 10 years later? And basically, I feel like at Bayer is the place that I can make the most difference in helping to solve some of the challenges that we're facing. We all know these, we hear about them all the time, the fact that we have a huge population growth over the next couple of decades. We have to have 50% more food and feed than we're producing right now in the next few decades. We've already got a third of the land use for agriculture, but that amount of available land is shrinking. We already use a large fraction of our water for growing food, and so there's not much room there to increase the amount of water that we're using. And we're experiencing losses, harvest losses due to the effects of climate change. And so, I feel like now is the time that we have to make huge strides and advances in agriculture science. And fortunately, there is a lot of movement in this area to think differently about agriculture, to move into the digital age with agriculture. And I think it's really the only way that we can maximize the amount of yield that we're getting from every acre of land, because that's what's going to be required. And so this slide sort of shows that we have certain aspirations, and I'm really having trouble reading some of this, but essentially trying to think differently about agriculture, manage inputs. So inputs like fertilizers and pesticides are extremely expensive for farmers. They have to be able to make a living off of their crops. But with these things becoming more and more expensive, they have to be able to use them in a smarter way. We also have societal pressures to try to reduce the amount of pesticide used, and also to try to make products that are used in the field safer. And so we have aspirations to do that, and reduce resistance, resistance management for some of our products. And so we're trying a number of different approaches all at once. So we're looking at how we design new products, what technology, artificial intelligence, for example, that could be used to design safer molecules, and also being smarter about how we use those products through precision agriculture, so like see and spray, And then also new business models that we can work with farmers to help them sequester carbon, for example, and tap into carbon markets to increase their standard of living and get rewarded for climate smart practices, because they're really, it's up to them. It's their choice to adopt these practices, but if we can make it economically advantageous, then that's also, if it's a business model that can be implemented, why not, right? So, getting back to the question that I posed at the beginning, what is something that you do every day, or maybe almost every day, that has some risk associated with it? I'm asking the audience. Drive? Right. Excellent. Any other suggestions? Eat. That's true. You could catch salmonella or some other foodborne illness every time if you're not careful with your food. Drink water, sure. That can be dangerous, especially in certain parts of the world. Cross a busy street, right? Get on an airplane. So how do we mitigate those risks? How do we make it so we feel like it's maybe okay to take those risks? What are some things that we do? Regulation. How about seatbelts, right? Airbags, car seats for little kids, right? Because you know that it's possible you could have an accident anytime that you get in the car, right? But if you can build in some safety features or improve those safety features, then that can be helpful if you get in an accident. But maybe the chances are you may never get in an accident. That's okay. Um, Getting on an airplane. I got on an airplane to come here. There could have been an accident. But I trusted that the pilot was well trained, that the airplane was sound, that it had been inspected recently, that it has safety features to make sure it doesn't run into another plane, for example. And so these are the concepts that folks in Bayer think about a lot. Risk assessment, assessing the risk, and then risk management. And so we think about hazard versus risk. So hazard is something that has the potential to harm you. So getting in a car has a potential to harm you. But the risk is the likelihood that that hazard will cause harm. So when it comes to pesticides, of course, these molecules are designed to kill something. If they're a herbicide, they're designed to kill weeds. If they're an insecticide, they're designed to kill insects. But if you manage your exposure and bring it down to well below any level of harm, then it can be safe and you mitigate that risk from the hazard. So, for example, this is a list of the LD50, that's a lethal dose to 50% of the population of some common chemicals. So water can be lethal. So if you drank 6 liters of water all at once, let's say if you could snap your fingers and guzzle down 6 liters of water, that would kill half the people that did that. Caffeine. So I don't know where my cup of coffee's down there, right? I've had 3 or 4 cups of coffee, over the whole day. But if you have 118 cups of coffee all at once, that's actually can be lethal. But you're minimizing, if you're just having a few cups a day, yes, there is some risk from the caffeine, but your, your, your level of exposure is quite low. Same thing with alcohol. We know alcohol can be dangerous not only from an impairment perspective, but it can actually kill you if you drink too much. So just it kind of give you an idea of the concepts that we deal with on a daily basis in Bayer Crop Science. Now I had a video about designing active ingredients, but unfortunately I'll have to share the link with you all to look at these after the seminar. But it's a nice short little video that talks about how we design what they call active ingredients or pesticides. And so the point is that you have, in order to have a healthy food, you have to have healthy plants. Now, if you're a plant and a farmer puts you in a field, you really can't run anywhere, can you? You can't run away from the bugs, and you can't run away from diseases. And a plant doesn't have any way to cure itself from these things. And then if you have a lot of weeds in that field, you're not. It's going to steal the nutrients away from you. So this video talks about how we can design molecules that are very, very precise in their mode of action. They may be designed to kill a very specific species of bugs, or to cure a disease, or to kill certain kinds of weeds. And so there's a lot of science behind the design of active ingredients. And certainly we've, from the days of the DDT era, where maybe you're putting out pounds of active ingredient per acre, maybe 10 pounds an acre back in the day. Now we're at tens of grams of active ingredient per acre. And you think about, that's maybe a salt shaker full for a whole acre by the time you measure it out. So anyway, hopefully you'll have a chance to take a look at that video. So getting down a little bit to, let me check my time. What time should I finish? Quarter after? 20 after? Okay. So getting into the development of new active ingredients and the cost. So this is actually an old slide from about 2014. And so this is the breakdown of cost in millions of dollars for the development of a new product. And so if you look online at the requirements for registration of a new pesticide, it's right there on the EPA website. It has links to every single study that's required. And this breaks it down into different categories of studies. And so the one in the circle is environmental chemistry studies. So it's about $30 million to do all the environmental chemistry related studies for a new active ingredient. And it takes about 8 to 10 years to do all the studies needed for a new active ingredient. And so once you get through all of that, you want to be darn sure that you're going to pass the regulatory hurdles after you've made those investments. So companies don't undertake development of new products very lightly. They want to make sure that it's going to pass all of the risk assessment that's required by the different regulatory authorities. If you're talking about GMO traits, it's about 280, 300, let's just say $300 million for a new agrochemical, and somewhere around 140, $150 million for a new GMO trait. for all the studies, and GMO traits can take 12 to 15 years to do all the testing. Once you submit all the studies to the regulatory authorities, it can be 3 years after that before you actually get a decision. And then it takes maybe another year to 2 years to get it on the market and selling. So it's a long, long process. So getting to in a little bit more specific about the environmental fate, there's guideline studies that we're required to do. So each of the studies, looking at soil metabolism, for example, absorption coefficients, and photolysis, for example, degradation in water. Each study is designed to isolate one primary degradation mechanism. And you have very controlled conditions, and you have controlled temperature, controlled moisture. You try to control as many factors as you can, and you use radio label standards so that you can get a mass balance at the end of the study. It's required that you get greater than or equal to 90% mass balance by the end of the study. So if you go to the EPA website and look up Series 835, that has the whole list of studies that's required for environmental fate. And so this is a list of the specific guideline studies. And so we also have all the basic physical chemical properties that are measured, like hydrolysis and solubility, vapor pressure, all of that, for not only the parent, but all the metabolites. So we look at abiotic and biotic studies, and we identify any metabolite that's more than 5 to 10% of the total mass formed during the degradation of the during the study. And sometimes if we have a major metabolite, we might do an entirely separate guideline study just on that metabolite and see what the degradation pathway is for that. So the cool thing about the environmental chemistry data is that it feeds into the other parts of the dossier. So the other team members use this data to help design their studies. Of course, somebody who's trying to do an aquatic study, an ecotox study, for example, is going to need to know what the solubility is of a particular compound, right? And they're going to need to know whether it degrades rapidly in water or whether it's light sensitive, these kind of things. It's all necessary for the tox studies, the ecotox studies, and for the environmental exposure modeling that goes on. And so a big part of the environmental chemistry data goes into the creating the exposure assessment. And so this is a concept of the regulatory authorities wanting to know sort of what is the worst case scenario? What is the maximum estimated exposure in the environment? So they use very conservative regulatory models along with the data that we generate in environmental chemistry. And they include different scenarios that look at how the compound is going to be used on what kind of crops, what parts of the country, and building in weather data. And so from this, they can determine an estimated concentration in water, in food, and in soils, for example. And so the EPA has a system, a tiered risk assessment system. And so if I go back here, essentially the risk is the function of the hazard of the compound and the exposure. So you need both of those things. You need to not only know what the potential toxicity is of the compound, but you also need to know how much is the exposure. And that's really how you calculate the risk. And so you can do different tier types of assessments. The tier ones are the simplest and most conservative assessments. And so if you pass the tier one risk assessment, pretty much you can say you're good, you know. But a lot of times there is a potential exceedance of a risk assessment for a particular compound. And from there, they'll move into a level 2, a tier 2 assessment, or a higher tier assessment that's even more detailed. And so with each tier, you're getting more and more into a more realistic scenario and not and more detailed analysis. And it takes much, much more time to do those higher tier assessments. And so we have experts that this is the kind of work that they do, these very detailed assessments. And so just to give you an example, I'm going to show you some of the kinds of data that we look at on a regular basis. And this is a compound called metribuzin, which is a herbicide. And so when you start looking at the study reports that are in regulations.gov, or that are the assessments that the EPA authorities do, they'll generate a table like this with the basic, the structure, the molecular structure, and information on the physical chemical properties. And so for this compound, it's got selective activity on certain grasses and broadleaf weeds. And it's similar to atrazine, like atrazine, and has similar mode of action. So it has a certain toxicity to plants that's very specific. And so this is a summary of the E-fate properties for metribuzin. And so you can see that we have the degradation pathway for metribuzin. It has two major degradation, has two main metabolites that then further degrade and then ultimately to CO2. So that's a good thing. So you want your compound ultimately to degrade. You want it to work, and then you want it to go away. So ideally. So this compound does degrade well in soil, and it is ultimately mineralized. It also photodegrades in both water and soil. However, it has a relatively low octanol or organic carbon partition coefficient. And this may raise some concerns with groundwater, because if you have a low affinity for organic carbon, it means that it's going to stay more in the dissolve phase, maybe move with the groundwater, or move with water down into the groundwater. And it also is stable in water. So once it gets in the water, it's actually pretty stable. So that can be a concern. And so the items that are outlined in green, those are kind of positive attributes of this compound. And the ones that are in red are ones that, maybe have some worry. For example, we always measure hydrolysis. And for this compound, it has a hydrolysis half-life of 600 days. So that's pretty much not degrading, but it is measurable. And so the partition coefficients are fairly low. And so how do you handle that? So you have, herbicides are important. And it's important that you rotate herbicides and not use the same ones all the time. And so you need multiple herbicides on the market. And so how do you make those decisions about whether to register a compound? And so, for example, there's a thing called the pesticide water calculator. It's a model that's used by EPA. And what it does is it generates a peak or acute concentration um, based on scenarios of a theoretical pond next to a field. And so it takes into account the intrinsic properties, effate properties of the compound, and then it takes into account that you have parents and metabolites. You can assume the worst case scenario with respect to degradation rates of a combination of the parent and metabolites. And then you can take into account the maximum proposed application rate, the maximum number of possible applications per season. You can assume 100% of the crop area is applied, and then use it, the sort of scenarios that have meteorological data that have, sort of huge storm events that could happen based on real weather data. And so from this, you can calculate what's called a risk quotient, and essentially you're taking that estimated environmental exposure concentration from the model and comparing it to the toxicity, the measured toxicity of the compound. And so, you know, this boils everything down into a single number. And so these come up, at this point you're looking at chronic risk and acute risk. And so for chronic risk, the level of concern is 1. So if you're at an exposure level that's higher than the toxicity, if you're 1 or greater, then that can be a concern. For acute risk, they have a level of concern of 0.5, and for endangered species and aquatic animals, it's 0.05, so very, very low, and terrestrial plants and aquatics at 1.0. So the idea is that the models are quite conservative, and the assumptions of the model are very conservative, and so that if you pass this kind of risk quotient approach, then you can be pretty sure that you're covering yourself with respect to safety, and that the risk to a particular species is low. And so if you go into the EPA assessment of metribuzin, you can see something like this. So where they break it down into different types of organisms, and they tell you whether whether you've exceeded the limit of concern, or the level of concern, I'm sorry. And so you can see that for the plant species, there is a risk. Well, that's because it's a herbicide. Okay, so you would expect that there would be some danger to plant species from this compound. And so, yes, it's intrinsically a herbicide. It works on a herbicide mode of action. And so it could kill plants that you don't want to kill. So you have to build in safety into the pesticide label for this compound. And so if you look at this figure here, this kind of gets into risk management. So EPA does a risk assessment, but then the agency can decide to put in risk management factors on the pesticide label, like don't apply this near very sensitive plant species that you don't want to damage, or have a 100-foot buffer from certain types of very sensitive plants. And so that's what they call mitigation, or if there's an aquatic concern, it could be that you want to have put in a buffer to any kind of waterways. And so these are the kinds of decisions that regulators have to make, right? There can be benefits At EPA, they do a risk-benefit analysis. So they look at the risk, they try to mitigate any risk, but then they also look at the benefits. And maybe having this other herbicide on the market, it brings maybe a new mode of action that can be useful for resistance management. It maybe manages a problem pest. So I was speaking with a scientist today about a new kind of insect pest on soy that they have not found any product that works on it. And it's causing maybe 60% damage in farmers' fields. And they don't have any way to control it. And so there are certain pests that are really, really tough to manage. And so having more choices, more availability of products on the market sometimes can be considered a benefit. And maybe it's a product that's more efficacious than others. Maybe you're able to use a lower rate of application for a particular compound. And so they take all these kind of considerations into account during their review process. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of concepts that we deal with. But these are all the kind of factors, economic factors, public values, and other pressures that they take into account when they make a risk management decision. And so the last thing I want to mention is a program that we have called Transparency. And it's a place where we're trying to address concerns that we've received, from our people, even from our families and from people that we work with and people that just in the public, that they have a lot of concerns that we don't test our products. And there's a lot of misperception out there that there's no testing of products before they go on the market. And so this is a concern. And so just to reiterate that we have to, for any kind of GM product that we register, there's something like 75 studies that are done. And when you say studies, a study can be a year-long, a multi-million-dollar study, but up to 75 studies that are done for GM products, and around 150 studies for a crop protection product. So we really do test. We're required to test. And another concern that a lot of people have is that we're hiding our studies somehow. And the issue there is that the way the intellectual property system is set up is that those study reports go into the regulatory authorities, but historically there's not been an easy way for the public to access those. But we are governed by a huge number of standards and guidelines that are set by international bodies. And so we do really follow all the rules, but we realized that wasn't enough. And so we're taking an extra step. So back in 2017, we started making and we were the first to voluntarily, it was not any kind of government requirement, to enable access to our pesticide safety study reports. So we have a website you can go to today, and you can look at the summaries of our safety studies. So these are huge reports, and just the summaries themselves are quite detailed. But you can actually request an entire study report if you want. And so initially it was just pesticide study reports, but now we're also enabling access to our GM crop safety study reports, more information on plant breeding, and also we've launched a program called Open Labs 360, which is a virtual platform that you can go and see how we conduct residue studies. And so this is the list of compounds that are available on the Transparency website. So it's around 30 fungicide, herbicide, insecticide products. And all of these are available, and also around 15 of our GM crop products. So we can only offer those that are products that we own. So it's none of our competitor products, but just ours. And so if you go to the Transparency site, you can download and view our safety study summaries. And really the point is not just so that you can go and access them easily. The other part of it is that if people have questions, we want to have a dialogue. We want to answer those questions. And so maybe you don't see the kind of study that you're really looking for your research. If you really want something, you can reach out to us. We can have a dialogue and see if we can accommodate your needs. But there's a lot of information, a lot of things like our, the degradation pathway for compounds, the list of metabolites, the information on degradation of those metabolites, all that is available. And so this is the other video that I was going to show you, that it's a little demo of our Open Labs 360 platform. And it's basically almost like a little video game in a way. You can go and click around and see different parts of how we do the studies. And there's little videos from some of our scientists. And anyone can access this website. You don't have to register or do anything to access it. It gives you a really nice sense of how we do what's called GLP, or good laboratory practice studies. Oh, is it going to work? Maybe? Maybe not. Okay. And so when we decided to do transparency, there was a lot of concern, within our company. There was a lot of people that weren't as thrilled about this idea. And there were also people from other companies that were very concerned. Oh, you're going to have all kinds of people, taking this information and doing negative things with it. But that really hasn't happened. It's been overwhelmingly positive response. We've had a lot of people, not an enormous, but a lot of people visiting the website. And people have downloaded the summary files. We've had about 200 requests for full study reports that we've delivered on. And the requests have come from academics, journalists, and private citizens. And basically 0 requests from those people that are anti-pesticide groups. And so basically we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from regulators. They like having us put our work and data out there. It makes their job easier. And so I think after 5 years, we feel like it's been a huge investment of time, but very well worth it. And feel like it's a good example to set for, the industry, to make sure that we're making things available to the public and information, because we're proud of the work that we do in the lab. We feel like we do good work. And it's actually nice to be able to share that with people. So as a final plug, I just want to mention the journal. I'm deputy editor of this new ACS journal called Agricultural Science and Technology. And so it's sort of a daughter journal of agriculture and food chemistry. And so it's more on the applied side, applied research in agriculture, soil science, plant science, crop protection, and regulation and trade. And so I invite you to take a look at the journal. If you're interested in publishing in paper, I welcome that, and would be happy to speak more about the journal. That's something I really enjoy working on. And then we also have the Food Science and Technology is another daughter journal that just started. So we're just in our third year. We don't have an impact factor yet, but we're fingers crossed that we get one this year. And yeah, and that's sort of the end of my talk. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Laura. Really interesting presentation. Several times you mentioned metabolites. I've always been fascinated by them and sometimes a little bit terrified by them. You use the term major metabolite and referred to further study. What kind of criteria make a metabolite a major metabolite? In other words, how do you know what metabolites need further study?
Right. So a lot of times when we're doing these guideline studies, right? So we start out with 100% of the parent at the beginning of the study and say if we do a soil metabolism study. And we take samples at different time intervals, and we measure because they're radio labeled, we can go in and do an LC analysis with a radio detector, so we know those peaks have to be associated with our parent compound. So when we see the parent peak and then we start seeing an increase in a second peak, that's a metabolite, right? That's a degradation product. And so over the course of a study, typically what happens is that you initially see an uptick in your metabolite formation. Maybe it's one metabolite, it could be multiple ones, and then you generally see a decline, okay? And so you have further degradation happening and maybe popping up some additional, what they call minor metabolites. So anything above 10%, especially if you have, 50, 60, 70% formation of a metabolite, that's a major metabolite. Then that's where the ecotox colleagues come into play, and they can do testing on those metabolites to safe for sensitive organisms. If it's an insecticide, they may do some testing with shrimp or small fish. And if it's showing toxicity, if it's potentially a concern, then we might do additional testing just on that metabolite. We might want to do a soil metabolism study just on that compound and find out for sure what the degradation rate is in soil for that compound. And so we want to make sure we have the answers to all the questions that regulators may ask us. So we try to think through every piece of that. And so if we find out that the compound's not very toxic at all, we maybe do less testing. But yeah, we want to 100% understand what's happening with metabolism, for any new compound.
Hi, I have two questions. Thank you for your talk, and I appreciate your company's commitment to openness and transparency that other companies sometimes don't embrace. What do you do about long-term exposure so that you've got a product out there, you've run all kinds of studies, you're looking at the metabolites, you're looking at the parent, whatever you're evaluating to evaluate toxicity, but maybe the toxicity really comes to play over a longer term.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's certainly true with I'm taking the water seminar, and that's true with certain things we've taken. The other reality that we've talked about in our class is the mixing of various chemicals. So, I mean, think about, I was just talking with someone, when you have a person taking 8 drugs, and they go to a pharmacist, an elderly person perhaps, who says, well, there are cross-medicinal side effects in these 2 drugs, so you really can only take one or whatever. So those are 2 questions. And my third question is about alt-in. Perhaps you've heard about it.
Yes.
We deal with that here in Nebraska a lot, and we're very concerned about it. Perhaps you are too. So those are my three questions. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so the first question is about long-term exposure. So we do what they call chronic studies. So we do, for example, in the toxicology package, they do multi-generational studies. And I'm not a toxicologist, so I'm not going to go into much detail on that, but essentially we do our best and we follow all the guidelines to do the multi-generational studies that are required. And, also we have to re-register our compounds every 10 years or so. And so at that time, the regulatory authorities can look at any kind of issues that may be arising with respect to environmental persistence or adverse effects that may be happening and being reported, and they take into account all of that. Also, during that 10-year period, there may be new studies required, and so it's at that time that they will require us to do additional studies to bring us up to date on whatever the latest regulatory requirements are. There's also monitoring that happens. For example, USGS does a lot of groundwater monitoring, for example, around the country, and also states do their own, have their own monitoring programs. And so pesticides are probably the most heavily regulated industry in the world. There's more regulatory hoops to go through than almost any other kind of compound, other kind of chemical on the market. So I know that probably doesn't fully answer your question, but I would just say we're also required to report any kind of adverse effects that are reported, say through our regular helpline. All that has to be reported. So there is monitoring that happens. The other thing that we also try to do is make sure that our customers are using our products properly, and so we offer training and we have stewardship programs to make sure that if there's any potential issues that we try to minimize those. So the second question was around mixtures. So yeah, this is an issue that we have scientists that are working on this, looking at this issue quite carefully. And again, I'm not a toxicologist. When I've seen their presentations at scientific conferences, which we have scientists that present at conferences, that it looks, if you really look at all the data, it turns out it's actually very few compounds that contributed the majority of a toxicity within a mixture. And so if you look at all of the compounds, typically it's one or two that maybe contribute the majority of any toxicity associated with a particular sample. And so certainly there are concerns. We should keep still looking into potential for mixtures to cause an issue, but I haven't seen any presentations from our scientists that have really seen an issue. I mean, there's certain compounds that you don't want to apply together, and I think people, farmers are well aware of these. So those are on the label, typically the pesticide label. Yeah, that's basically the answer that I have for that. On the alt-in, certainly it's a challenging situation. I would say our company is fully involved with trying to manage that site properly. We've stepped up and tried to take responsibility for managing the site and implementing practices and taking actions to minimize any kind of exposure through water and through the air. So the All-10 Info website has all the latest information on that. And if there's folks that want to have a separate conversation on that site, I'm happy to try to facilitate that, to have specific questions.
The biggest problem is what's going to happen with all the waste. What once the lagoons began to leak and that, polluted water, and we also know about all the bee die-offs due to the actual presence of neonicotinoids, I guess, in the air,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure how the bees are exposed. Maybe through the
Yeah.
plants. I don't know. So my concern is, and I think many people are concerned about what will be done now with all the waste. Just putting them
Yeah.
on fields may not be the best solution.
Yeah. So I'll just say that anything that we do has to be approved by the state regulators, the State Department of Environment. So anything that gets done is in collaboration with them and under their supervision. And so, I think initially the focus was on stabilizing the site, and now they're putting into place plans, to manage the site long term. And so those are still under review, from what I understand. So I believe that, there's been public comment periods, there have been public meetings that have happened, and the groups have been reporting out on what the plans are to date. But it's going to be a long process, I think. Yeah.
I've got a question. I remember you talked about your PhD work on chlorinated pesticides. What are the circumstances that lead up to banning a chemical, a plant protection product? What is required for a ban to occur?
Well, again, I'm not a regulator, okay? So I'm not a regulatory authority, but I would assume that there's multiple pathways to that. One can be just a concern about a product and, a political decision to cancel a certain compound or product. It could be that there are concerns that emerge, like, for example, some of the early organochlorines, when it was discovered that they cause cancer in humans, and those were banned back in the 60s and the 70s. I think now the regulatory system is such that a company would never, I shouldn't say never, but never knowingly try to register something that would cause cancer and have any kind of human health issues under normal use practices. And so there's a lot more stringent regulatory requirements than there were back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. So it would take, I think, it would be more difficult. It would be less likely to have bans in the United States anyway.
So it's less likely to occur than it would have been when I was a teenager, for example.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Okay. But the landscape, the regulatory landscape is constantly shifting and changing. And so the science still advances over time. We learn new things about toxicity. I mean, the toxicology field is still advancing, and so there could be decisions based on new knowledge that's not out there now. So, but it can also happen, after a product is launched, if a problem emerges that wasn't anticipated and wasn't identified in all the testing. And so sometimes what happens is that EPA can decide to ban products for certain uses where they see a risk. Maybe they don't completely ban it, but maybe they ban it for certain types of crops or certain types that say they may decide they don't want an aerial application of a certain compound anymore, but due to potential drift and or those kind of things happen all the time. It's not really a ban, but they can not
Restricted
approve
use.
certain uses.
Yeah, restricted use.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and that often happens when you have the re-registration
Yep.
process. Yeah.
Okay, anything in the Zoom?
We have a few online, but we're approaching 15 minutes of our time.
We are? Okay.
I'll send the online questions direct.
I'm sorry, I forgot about the online folks and making sure we got their questions. So apologies to.
All right,
anybody
well,
with
thank
questions.
you very much. Thanks for staying, everyone.